1999 The Podcast is a production of the Cage Club Podcast Network. For more podcasts on movies, comics, and all things pop culture, head to cageclub.me. To contact us with questions, comments, or just to say hi, send us an email at 1999@cageclub.me. You can find me on Twitter at probablyrealjb and Joey at Soulpot. And you can follow the show on Twitter at 1999 The Podcast. To support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. The show is written, produced, and edited by us. Welcome to 1999 The Podcast. I'm John Brooks.
And I'm Joey Lewandowski.
And it is Memorial Day, which means that it's the summer movie season starting today. Or like, I guess it used to mean that. Does it still mean that?
It does, but it started on Thursday night when I saw Top Gun Maverick, the film of the summer.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting that of the three big summer blockbusters that are coming out for the beginning of summer movie season, like two of them are TV shows.
What are you talking about? Like, well, Bob's Burgers?
Well, no, I was thinking like Top Gun and then Stranger Things 4 and then Obi-Wan Kenobi. I just feel like the three
you mean just like what the entertainment that's kicking off. Gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Like actual TV shows, right? Not
Well, I don't know if this doesn't make sense here, but we're talking about it. But the reason there's so much TV happening in May is because May 31st is the Emmys deadline. So everything that debuts by May 31st is eligible. And
that's interesting.
That's why this last month has been crazy for new shows.
You would think they would have the deadline like at the end of the year.
I don't know, man. Nothing makes sense about anything. It also might have been impacted by COVID. I don't know. But yes, I guess the unofficial kickoff to summer. Well, I think Stranger Things has affixed itself to the 4th of July weekend, and the actual final episodes are airing then. So I don't know. Who knows? But yeah, Bob's Burgers crossing the Rubicon, maybe.
But there's definitely something about like Stranger Things that it's very like summer blockbuster vibe. And having the 4th season debut at the time of summer movie season starting. I don't think that's a coincidence. But you're right, they do the July 4th thing now. And
this is a lot of ramp up for a movie that is set at Christmas and that could not feel less like a summer blockbuster, even though it came out in summer.
Yeah, it's a real feel-good summer romp.
Did they build this as the feel-bad movie of the summer? Because they should have.
Yeah, but it wasn't even, I don't think it was even the feel-bad. Maybe it was. It might have been the most depressing movie of the summer. But either way, we are at July 16th. This is 2 days after the limited release of our last movie, The Blair Witch Project. This is the day that birthed 1,000 QAnon conspiracies because it is the day that John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette died in a plane crash.
Allegedly.
Today's movie stars Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, Sidney Pollack, Todd Field, with Thomas Gibson, Rada Sherbeja, Lily Sobieski, and the rising star of Cate Blanchett, or at least her voice.
I forgot that this is a Tom Cruise weekend.
Big Tom Cruise weekend.
Both in 99 and now. Yeah. I mean, it's not really 1999 now, but 1999 celebrated now and in real life now. Wow. Someone should do a podcast about that, man.
The final film written and directed by the legendary Stanley Kubrick is, of course, Eyes Wide Shut. Joey, can you give us a plot rundown? What is Eyes Wide Shut about?
What isn't it about? I mean, it's about marital discourse and strife and tumultuous relationships and fear of toxic masculinity and all sorts. I mean, it's a 3-hour movie or 2 hours and 45 minutes or whatever. Like, there's a lot it's covering, but really about a crumbling marriage and infidelity and toxic masculinity and all that fun stuff. Everything you go see a movie in the summer for.
And which character is Tom Cruise in that?
He plays Dr. Bill, the toxic masculinity.
Yeah, that's a pretty good synopsis. It's less of a movie that is plot-driven than it is theme-driven, right? And I think that's pretty true of a lot of Kubrick's work. Anyway, while our last film, The Blair Witch Project, was notable for having one of the shortest film shoots in history at just 8 days, Eyes Wide Shut holds the record as the longest continuous film shoot at 400 days.
Seems cool.
That's a lot. Kubrick was a notorious perfectionist, and the editing of the film alone took another year. So to say that, it's true that Eyes Wide Shut fits in a lot of ways into the sort of 1999 aesthetic of the films that push boundaries and have all this like angst, right, that sort of underlies them. The film itself is really a product of the last sort of half decade of the 1990s, since it began production actually in 1996. So it really is a movie that spans a pretty long time and just sort of happened to hit I think, in the right year, right? I mean, that's sort of why we're including it in our list of kind of the essential 1999 movies.
And I think we'll talk about this probably with our guests, but I feel like it's the kind of movie that could kind of come out whenever and still would feel like it's of that year, of that time, of the themes that people are talking about and thinking about at that moment in time.
I agree that it's a movie whose themes could be applied to any time. I think the version of the movie that we got is very specific to that time. But after 9/11, I think a lot of the way that people approach some of these issues begins to change. But yeah, it's as we know, based on a work that is much earlier than the 1990s. So anyway, of course, Cruise and Kidman, the stars of this movie, were at the time Hollywood's most famous couple and had already starred together in Days of Thunder in 1990 and Far and Away in 1992. And some suggest the famously demanding Kubrick pushed their marriage to the breaking point. Their contracts for the film were open-ended, essentially handing over their lives to Kubrick for as long as he wanted them. And Kubrick also subjected both Cruise and Kidman to draconian rules about when they could and could not interact on and off set. Kubrick himself may have worked himself to death with the film. He died on March 7th, 1999, just days after submitting his final cut, though his co-writer, Frederick Raphael, also claims that Sidney Pollack, himself an accomplished filmmaker, is actually responsible for the cut that would ultimately hit theaters. Either way, the film is well received, if not overwhelmingly praised by critics and audiences. It has a 75% critics rating and a 74% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, and a respectable score of 68 on Metacritic. It's worth noting, however, that the critical division is unusually stark, with critics who reviewed it positively giving the film overwhelming praise and vice versa, and very little in between. The word masterpiece gets tossed around a lot in a lot of those positive reviews, including in the one from AV Club's Nathan Rabin. And among those who heaped nothing but praise on the film were USA Today's Mike Clark, who called it, quote, a precisely modulated and mostly mesmerizing suspense movie, in part because it's one of the most bravely disturbing screen works ever attempted about thoughts withheld by even the most devoted marriage partners and the ramifications of voicing them. But among the most notable detractors were the Village Voice's Jay Hoberman, who said it feels like a rough draft at best, the New York Post's Jonathan Foreman, who called it Stanley Kubrick's Hindenburg, and once again, Slate's David Edelstein, who we talked about in the Phantom Menace episode, who called it, quote, a somnolent load of wank.
Pretty harsh words.
It's not great.
Because now, when people look back at it now, like, it's almost widely considered a masterpiece. And like,
Yes.
I think a lot of people would even argue it's maybe his best movie.
Yes. And that is the case. All those critics are wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the things that we tend to find, just sort of like, I don't know, anecdotally, or just sort of what I notice, is that a lot of the movies that have really polar reviews, where let's say like 3/4 of them are positive and 1/4 of them are negative, and the negative ones are also very pronounced. They're not wishy-washy. They're like, this is bad. Are the ones that tend to, when they get revisited, go all one way or the other, which is to say that, like, right, that the minority proves right, or the minority gets swayed over onto the correct side of the dial, which in this case is the side that views this movie as something of a masterpiece and one of the best movies of the 90s and certainly of 1999. And that is the case. Like, a lot of those critics have since gone back and given it a second look and been like, okay, I didn't get it then and I get it now. And again, I think that is that's kind of very typical of a lot of Kubrick's work. People don't tend to dislike it more over time.
Well, I think that with his movie, like with most good art, like being able to revisit it is going to only help it. And I think it also points to like a flaw in film criticism, and just like all criticism. It's like, you don't know when you're catching these critics, if they're having a bad night, they have to watch it on a Tuesday night for like publication on Wednesday morning, and they only get to watch it once, and they might not be able to they take like great notes, and just like they might not remember, and like if they're in a bad mood, or it's just like they're whatever, they're just stressed or anything. It's like, no, this is like New York Times calls it, or whatever, calls it a bad movie because like, he was having he and his girlfriend got into a fight that night. It's just like, well, so.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, certainly I think anybody who's seen Eyes Wide Shut can say that it's one of those movies that you have to be in the mood for. And I think that also applies to when critics see a movie, right, in a screening, that like they have to be in the mood for it to really get it. I think there's a lot of movies like you kind of know what you're getting when you go into it, so you can kind of mentally prepare yourself, right? If it's like a horror movie or something like that, right? You can do the advanced work of setting yourself up for what you're about to see. With Kubrick, you kind of know you're going to be like, taken on a journey, right? And so I can definitely understand that a critic in the sort of wrong frame of mind, especially in some of those screenings, which can be really grueling. Sometimes you're watching like 4 movies in a row on like a Tuesday morning. I get it, but I think this, sort of proves the theme of Kubrick is that very rarely do negative views of his movies tend to last for a long time, and people tend to come around.
Well, I think there's also, and this is now sort of deviating a little bit from Kubrick from this movie, but it feels like with so many auteurs and people that are like, I was talking about this recently with both the new Kendrick Lamar album and also with the new Robert Eggers movie, where it's like, I think people are afraid now of being the one person who speaks out against like, oh, this album's not good, this movie's not good, when everybody else is just like, oh my God, you need to see this. And it's like, well,
yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, and just, go see everything and make your own decisions.
And there are people who thrive on being the dissenting voice as well, right? But again, when you're a film critic and you're seeing a movie and you really don't know how other people have reacted to it, it's hard to do that on purpose, right? Unless you do it like later on, and then you're like, I'm the one who thinks it's bad, and I'm gonna build my career on being wrong about that. But the question really then is, as you alluded to earlier, that this may be the Kubrick masterpiece. It may very well be his greatest film, and that is often a debate. Much of the debate these days is not whether or not Eyes Wide Shut is great or good, but whether or not it is the greatest or goodest of Kubrick's canon. And so that is one of many things that we will be asking today's guest. So Joey, who is our guest today?
Our guest today is New York Magazine feature writer and author of the July 2019 Vulture article, What I Learned After Watching Eyes Wide Shut 100 Times, Lila Shapiro.
100 times is a lot of times to watch Eyes Wide Shut.
I think it's more than I've watched any movie, but I don't know. Probably.
It's about 96 more times than I've seen it. But we will see what Lila has to say. We will be right back with Lila Shapiro. Welcome to the show, Lila. Thanks for joining us. And I'm very excited to talk to you specifically about this particular movie, because I think you may, if they kept records of this sort of thing, you may hold the world's record for the person who has seen Eyes Wide Shut the most, which you claim is 100 times. Now, is that a scientifically tabulated number, or is that a guess based on sort of circumstantial evidence around your viewing habits of that movie?
It's very much a broad estimate, I would say. Mm-hmm. It felt like 100 times. It could have been more, to be honest.
Wow.
It could have potentially been less. I mean, I will say that there was a certain point in my viewing and reviewing in which I was also like doing other things. So, it's not like
So if there's like a Guinness Book of World Records person watching you, you would not get credit for like 2 or 3 of them is what I'm I'm gathering.
I think that would be fair to say.
So like sitting down and watching it attentively, what's the number, do you think, the number of times that you've watched it with like interest and investment?
Well, definitely like dozens of like of times in which, I was actually just watching it. and not also writing or cleaning my apartment or talking on
Right.
the phone or doing all the other things. I mean, I was like working on a book actually during the time of like the peak rewatching, and I had just gotten married. My husband was away for a month on like a reporting trip, and I was like, that was a month of just pretty much nonstop eyes wide shut consumption. And at the beginning of that time, like, I was definitely watching it attentively. As that month pushed on, I was just it was on. I wasn't necessarily with it every moment, and I feel like there are generally scenes in it that I would tend to space out in more, and
Mhm.
scenes that, like, I could watch infinite numbers of times because 'cause they're so perfect and compelling.
I think a lot of people listening would be like, "You just got married and your husband's out of town. This is the worst possible movie for you to watch on repeat in those circumstances."
I would argue it depends on your point of view. I think it depends on your point of view. I think that Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise's characters are going through the same exact thing in this, and just
Right.
one trusts the other a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right, and it's like it depends how you feel about having gotten married, about being married, about what it means to be married. Are you is one in shock about this decision? Maybe. That was
Yeah.
part of it. But it was definitely like uh settling in to those to those feelings of uneasiness that I think,
Right.
I was kind of leaning into that.
So do you think it was kind of more therapeutic to you, or like, I don't know, what do you think was your sort of what was the nature of the addiction? Because I mean, you do write about it a little bit, in your piece about this, but what was sort of like, obviously you probably watched it once and then again and again and again, and what was kind of feeding that? Was it kind of comforting, or was it just sort of a way of kind of investing in these uneasy feelings that you might have had?
Uh, yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a comforting movie.
No,
So,
it's not.
I wasn't looking for comfort, but it was very I mean, it is very, like, entrancing.
Yeah.
Um, and, because I was working on this novel at the time, it did feel like this almost, like, shortcut to getting into this, like, dreamlike space that I wanted to be in while I was writing. So, I think that was part of it. I mean, and the book was also sort of exploring some of the themes, that are in Eyes Wide Shut as well. So, I think that there was a lot of it was, like, sort of about, like, getting into this, like, trance-like state. Um, the music is also, like, so beautiful, and the light is so beautiful in it, so it's, like, there's also just this very, like, moody quality, to all of it. So, and then I think further it was about, like, leaning into this feeling of uneasiness, wanting to, like, explore that and sit with it, as well as this sense that, like, actually, I do think that this is a movie that rewards rewatching, like, it
Mhm.
can seem very, like, um, opaque or, like, I mean, and I talk about this in the piece, like, how I feel like it was, misviewed when critics were first, encountering it and writing about it. So,
For sure.
it's like there are these, like, layers that are unpeeled that are so that's satisfying too. So it's not just, like, wanting to space out, but also feeling like as you're watching it more, it's sort of revealing more of itself.
So one of the things that we do when we have guests on this show is ask them about their initial experience with the movie, because we are covering the movies of 1999. I'm going to start with you. I'm also going to ask Joey the same question. But when was the first time that you saw this? Did you see it when it came out in theaters?
I saw it Yeah, I did see it in theaters, and I guess it was, like, I was in high school,
Hmm.
and I think I must have snuck in because I was not 18 yet.
Right. And they were I remember them being very particular about not letting, because like you could get into a lot of R-rated movies if you weren't 18, but like this was one of the ones they treated like an NC-17 movie for a lot of theaters. I remember that fact about it, and understandable to some degree.
Yes, I definitely like I feel that I saw it as part of like I was with a friend, there was like a plan to sneak in, and I think we saw something else first and then saw the second. We were already
Oh,
like
smart.
inside.
Yeah, the old trick.
Yeah, and
that's not a lot of movies that way.
and I think like, at this period of my life, like I was very into The Shining. I had seen The Shining probably like dozens of times. I mean, I also like, just to say generally about myself, like I am a rewatcher, reviewer, rereader. I like to really like be with a piece of work that I'm interested in. So I had seen The Shining, I think like dozens of times, and I loved The Shining. I don't think that I was immediately at this phase in my life, like, so captured by Eyes Wide Shut. Like, I remember liking it, but I also remember feeling, like, not immediately moved by it. And, like, it wasn't, and not really finding it all that, like, memorable as a, like, 17-year-old, 16-year-old, girl.
Yeah.
But it was, but I did. So then, like the next rewatch after that was like it was during this phase of my life when I was like, I'm curious about Eyes Wide Shut. I want to go back to Eyes Wide Shut. I think I might have seen it one other time in college that was also not that memorable. But it was really like as an adult after I'd gotten married and wanting to revisit it because I was curious, and then being like, wow, I'm about to become obsessed. And that was like the reconnection was really what it was about for me.
Joey, I assume, again, you were 11 years old when this movie came out. I'm guessing this was one of the many movies of that year that you did not see in theaters. What was your first experience with Eyes Wide Shut?
Well, as I will say, literally every episode we do, I did not see this in theaters that year. I'm sure I saw movies in theaters in 1999. I don't know what they were. It was nothing we're going to cover on the show if I saw anything in theaters. But I'm looking, before my Letterboxd phase of life, I used to just keep track of movies in Excel. And I started doing that when I went off to college. And so I was like, I'm watching all of the world's best movies because I've basically seen nothing. And so I'm looking through my list. And basically in the like 2 weeks before I saw this for the first time, probably like my sophomore year of college, maybe, I also saw for the first time the original Dawn of the Dead, Die Hard, Full Metal Jacket, Blue Velvet, Inland Empire, Eraserhead, The Shining. So, like, I guess I was on like a Kubrick and Lynch kick at that point, which feels like a very sophomore in college thing to do. And I remember really liking it. And I don't remember if I've seen it again, but then I watched it again, obviously, when we did the Tom Cruise podcast. And then I watched it again for this. So I think it's probably the Kubrick movie I've seen the most, except my total number is 3 as opposed to, 100 or something. But you were asking me, a week ago when we were talking about this movie for the first time, like, what if I like it or if I love it, or like, because you're saying like it's a movie that I don't remember how you described it. I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but like, I think this might be my favorite Kubrick, but I also don't know, and I don't know. I think from what I understand, there's like a kind of like a mixed reception that's like aged. It's gotten better over time, but like, I think part of it, I've only seen most of his other ones once or twice, so I don't know if it's fair to call this my favorite, but like, I love this movie. I think it's captivating. And again, I've only seen it a couple times, but it sticks with me.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. I saw it in theaters. I saw it the night it opened. I think I mentioned that in one of our episodes in the past. But yes, I was sophomore in college, I guess, when it came out. And, I'd sort of been through the Kubrick crash course that you get when you're in college and like hanging out with a bunch of film majors, right? So I had my first experience with Clockwork Orange already. I'd watched 2001 when I was probably 12 or 13 years old. So I was definitely a Kubrick fan. I remember reading, there was 2 movies that I remember reading about the sort of development hell about while I was still in high school in '97. Titanic and this movie, they started filming it in '96, so it had a long road to the final version, which is of course not uncommon for Kubrick. But I remember seeing it. I remember being very moved by the fact that it was Kubrick's last work. I went to go see it with my friend Mike Wen in Seattle, and we just didn't talk to each other for the next hour after the movie. It's one of those things where I was just like, I don't know how to process this because I'm not really sure that I get exactly what it's trying to tell me, which took a couple more viewings. But certainly I was of the group of people who thought of it as a great film immediately and understood that it was great, and disagreed with the critics who were like meh about it. And yeah, I think what I would say is that it's not a movie that I don't know. It's hard to say that you love or like a movie that you struggle to watch because it's so intense and so, for lack of a better term, eye-opening, and sort of forces you to confront certain things. But I certainly think of it then and now as a masterpiece. And I think it's one of Kubrick's best films. And you can't say that when it comes out because people are like, it has to age. It has to be 20 or 30 years. Well, now it's been 20 or 30 years, 23 years. And I think it ranks as one of his greatest works. Lila, I get the impression, I mean, you sort of allude to the fact that you are a Kubrick fan of sorts. Where do you think this ranks within the Kubrick pantheon?
I think it's definitely my favorite. And, I think it compared to something like, The Shining, which, I did love and, is like a great movie. But I don't enjoy rewatching The Shining, in part because, I think there's something about, in comparison, Eyes Wide Shut is so subtle. And there's something so subtle about the acting and the choices in the storytelling and the filmmaking. And I feel like that's the thing that's I mean, yes, it's very, very intense, but there's something that's very withholding about it in a way that I really am
Mm-hmm.
drawn to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I think about something like The Shining, it's just so the acting is so over the top in some ways that it's just not I don't feel compelled to rewatch it. I don't want to rewatch it and spend more time with Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall in the Overlook. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
But
it's intense.
it's very intense and it's almost also I don't know, it just feels you know, Eyes Wide Shut, just the fact that it's so withholding and so secretive. There's something about that I think that is incredibly compelling and more compelling than all of his other work. Even though I think he's a great director. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely for me the best one and his masterpiece.
I almost wish that I had spent the last 10 days rewatching all of his stuff. I want to, but I do think that there's something here that's both, I think what Lila was saying about it being open and also secretive. There's no secrets here and there's also full of secrets here. And this movie is just intriguing to me in ways that feel I think that there's something about the way that he makes movies and the way that Fincher makes movies are they're both so precise and so specific and so pre-planned and so this is the way that I want it and we're going to be here until you deliver it that way. And I think that there's something that I know that there's pros and cons to that, I'm sure, but I think he cracks something in this where it's, I mean, have we really talked about the fact that this, I don't know that this ended their marriage, but probably didn't help their marriage, right? There's a much lower stakes version of this with Deepwater now streaming on Hulu, which I recommend because it's wonderful and horny. But that was Ana de Armas and Ben Affleck together, and like that probably didn't help their marriage or their relationship, right? But to be only with your spouse basically for like 400 days in a different country with a director who is known for being demanding perfection and breaking you until you offer that, that's fascinating in and of itself. Like, even if the movie was terrible, just the fact that the making was, but then the movie's great. So like, there's layers on layers here, and I think it's the combination of secrets and openness, and it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, like he like almost like the sort of sadomasochistic energy between him and Tom Cruise is just like totally fascinating. Like he tortured him in some ways, it's like when you read about him like making him walk through a door 100 times, for 100
Hmm.
takes, or like, the whole sequence, how like he wouldn't let him come to set when Nicole Kidman was, shooting her sex scenes with the sailor, because he wanted, to stir up that pot is so compelling and so weird, and it's like, yeah, watching it just as, like, I mean, they were just, like, the most famous couple in the world, and then it seemingly tears their marriage apart. It's like a fascinating document.
Yeah, well, that and the movie itself is about those themes, and so I mean, understandably, you can say what you want about the marriage being kind of a sham anyway that like Scientology put together, but that's a different subject. Certainly, whatever was authentic about that marriage, you could understand that pretty much anybody's marriage would have a hard time surviving that process. I wonder what you think is. People would ask me sometimes, like, what do I think it's about? And that's it's kind of a tough question to answer, I think. To me, it is about the nature of trust and the ability to trust people, largely through the kind of barriers of both sexuality and also power structures. And um, I like in your essay about it the way that you allude to the fact that a lot of, especially kind of male critics of the time, derided the movie for being unbelievable that Tom Cruise's character would be this naive. And yet the reality, like when you really think about it and when you apply real life examples to it, is that the naivety on display there is very much a, if not a direct sort of portrayal of a reality, a workable metaphor for the naivety that we see all around us in our culture all the time, right?
Mm.
So do you have, like, would you have a way that you would say, here's what the movie is about, here's its thesis, and has your understanding of that or your interpretation of it changed over the course of the years and the time that you've spent with this movie?
Mm. Um, I mean, I see it as being about relationships between men and women within a specific milieu, like,
Hmm.
and within that framework being fundamentally about like power, the exercise of power, and like, and the way that like power, class, sex, like are kind of, interwoven with each other, in terms of like the themes that I see as like being most prominent. But I was thinking a little bit about what you're saying about like, you know, Tom and Nicole having like, this hype, who knows what their marriage really was, right? Maybe it was put together by Scientology, but it's like there's something about the way that this marriage is in the movie where you're like, they don't really seem to have any like connection particularly, or even to see each other per se. Like, you know, the whole, like, I mean, thinking of the opening, which she's like, "How do I look?" She looks, like, unbelievably beautiful, right? And he's like, doesn't look at her. And, like, there's this way that, like, and then they go and, and they're getting ready and they're going to this, like, party, and the party is, like, hosted by the man who we're gonna later learn is, like, either the host of the orgy or, like, a critically important person at the orgy, or just anyone at, he's there. He knows what's going on. He's like the man in power, the man with money, the man who can, who is using everyone, and they're sort of going to make nice with him. And like just the whole operation is like there's something about what that's what we see their marriages like. It's like they're going to be on display here. Like you don't really get the sense that they're two people who are interested in knowing each other, or like that's the point of their marriage. And like, in fact, like once, they actually have a conversation in which like Nicole's, character starts to like express her feelings, then it's like unbearable you know to Tom, and he runs out into the night. And it's like, so I don't know. To me, it's like yeah, like it is about like trust and the nature of trust, but I feel like it's more about like, it's like when you see what it's like he's 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 fleeing from intimacy in pursuit of secrets, power, money, and status,
Hmm.
and like when he finds horrible things there, like his reaction to that essentially is that he wants to be in the know, he wants to be included. And so it's like, to me, it's really about that more than it is about like sex, or like, you know actual relation, like an actual like intimacy, or
Right.
anything along those lines. And then in terms of your other question, like has it changed over the viewings? Like I think that I was like very like just part of what I think I was saw like over time is this like how that it was an exploration of Tom Cruise's naivete slash his character Dr. Hartford, both of them together, their
Yeah.
naivete,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like sort of the and a critique of it ultimately, and that was clearly like something that people like, yeah, many male critics didn't see at the time when it first came out. But it's like, and I was watching it, in the aftermath of Me Too, and it was very, in light of that moment, it just felt like, so prescient and so like smart about this like aspect of our culture, which is like a desire to like not just like to run away from intimacy, but to like run away from knowledge, to run away from knowing each other, and instead pursue like power, secrets, complicity in a system of, um, you know, uh, complicity in this system that abuses the powerless and concentrates, wealth and luxury, and, people who serve as objects like to this, elite.
Yeah, and there does seem to be like there's an element, I think, of that that appears in a couple of movies of that basic era. One of the things that you wrote about, that a lot of people have written about, is the death of the prostitute or whatever it is that she's hired to be at that party, and then there's the drug overdose, but it's like not clear that it's the same person, and I think it's actually two different actresses, right? And there's this sort of sense of the expendability and also just sort of the like Xerox ability of a certain class of people that is also present, I think, within like American Psycho, which I think deals with a lot of the same idea that there's like a place, a certain rank within society where identity no longer matters, and it's all just about status and power, and that sort of thing. Joey, quickly to you,
Yeah.
as someone who saw this movie much later, um, and obviously found meaning in it, as someone who did not see it in the context of the time, did those themes, those ideas, still seem as relevant to you at the time of seeing it the first time as they would have maybe, the end of the 20th century?
I don't know. I don't know if I have the context to answer that question. I think what's most interesting to me, and this is, what Lila, it was something that popped in my head as Lila was talking, is I think we don't really have a sense of the dynamic of their marriage. Like, we know that they've been together ostensibly for, I don't know, they have like an 8-ish-year-old daughter, right? So we figure probably they've been, like, do they ever explicitly say how long they've been together? Like maybe like 10 years-ish?
I don't think they ever explicitly say it, but that's what I've always assumed.
Ballpark, yeah. And like, the movie ends in a place where they're going to at least try to stick around, right? And try to, return to normalcy. I think what's interesting to me is, societal impacts and societal, Me Too of modern day, or the themes picked up in the late 90s, or anything in between, or anything that's going to be read into it in the future. I think if you just look at this like as not like a midlife crisis, but kind of like a midlife crisis for a marriage, like, I don't get the sense that either of them are really unhappy. I mean, I don't think either of them are actually really happy, but I don't know that they're unhappy. I think they're just sort of getting through it, and they hit like a speed bump, and then this might have like scared him straight. And I think, I don't know again that I have the context or the placement to like think about how it was perceived in 99, which is maybe the point of this podcast. But like, I think the story itself that it's telling of this like relationship, this dynamic between two adults in a relationship with responsibilities and whatever, I think that's what's most interesting to me. Because Nicole Kidman is bringing up, her character's bringing up this like thing that she like just thought a while back or dreamt about a while back. And that causes him to like fall down this rabbit hole that maybe he would have eventually anyway. But, I think that's what's interesting to me. And I think that is something that whether you're watching it in 1997 or not 97, Jesus, the podcast, 1997, the podcast, 1999 or 2022 or anywhere in between, I think like it's a very simple story and allegory kind of.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, like you say, like, or we talked about like Nicole's confession being the impetus, but it's like, as we see in the opening, like he's already on the verge of cheating on her. Like they both are like when they go to the party and like she dances with the Hungarian and he like hangs out with the two models and they like invite him, to like, well, find out where the rainbow ends, and like he wants to, but then he's like pulled away because he has to like deal with, the crisis with Ziegler and the like Mandy and unconscious Mandy. So it's like he already wanted to do that, was stopped from doing that, maybe felt ambivalent, and then it's like now there's another opportunity that he's going to try to, go for it now that he's been, now that he feels betrayed and has some like kind of excuse to continue on.
Like I wonder, and I don't remember, Lila, if this was in your piece or just what I was reading to like the reception of the time, but like I remember reading somewhere that people looked at this as like a prudish movie, that like Kubrick was just like this old man who didn't get it and like didn't understand where society was sexually and whatever. I think this was in your piece, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if, 23 years later, where like polyamory is maybe not like super widespread, but much more accepted than it was. Like, I wonder if the same movie was made or released now, like if that was something, because like it seems like they're dabbling to an extent on like having an open relationship, even though they don't actually have that conversation, right? And like I don't think he would want it. I don't even know if she would want it, but I think the jealousy of, I think they both might want to explore it for their own thing, but I don't think they want the other. And like you need that kind of like two-way street of it all. But I think that like that's also timely, sort of, in a way where like, especially like how many thought pieces I've seen like in Apple News over the last 2 years of people like, hey, like this is how the pandemic changed relationships and like everybody's doing everything. It's just like, okay. But I wonder, like, because it seems like it seems like they have an understanding. And they might, but I don't know to what extent. Like, I don't think their understanding is like, go sleep with whoever you want. But it's like, hey, we're going to a party. Like, if you want to be flirty, but like we're together. And then just like her admitting that she thought about going further is like, oh my God, I can't believe that my wife would mentally cheat on me. Or, I don't know.
I feel like, though, what you were saying earlier is like, I mean, there is this like, that it's like the timelessness of it. It's like these are thoughts that like couples like, that have been present like for, I don't know, at least the past 100 years, or if not forever. Like there's this way that like those like crisis or like small crisis or like imaginary crisis or whatever in the marriage is something that is like, you know, it's happening now, but it's also always been happening as long as there's been like marriage as it exists in the modern world.
You said, I think you mentioned that this is like, I don't know if we mentioned it in this podcast, but you mentioned in your piece that this is based on like a short story or a story of some kind from a different country from like a way different era, right? So like the fact that the actual theme is timeless, I think goes to prove that point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I love this conversation that like Kubrick and his screenwriter had when they first started talking about like whether or not like they could adapt this story for the modern era. It's originally sent in like turn of the century Vienna, and the screenwriter Frederick Raphael, he says like he says to Kubrick, like, but haven't many things changed since 1900? Like,
Yeah.
not least the relations between men and women. And Kubrick is just like, I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
love
then,
that
like,
conversation too. Yeah.
he thinks about it and he's like, neither do I. And it's like, okay, well, there you go.
And I think the movie kind of bears that thesis out, at least that sort of that assumption or that conclusion is one of sort of the driving parts of the narrative behind the story, right? That like things really haven't changed. There is this kind of fundamental challenge that relationships have by nature of being relationships that just don't change.
Yeah, and like in terms of how people read it at the time, I do think it's so tied in with like what the 90s was. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's like the height of the erotic thriller, which this movie was like sort of positioned as, and it's like, of course, like this is not an erotic thriller really, like in its interests. Like if you compare it to something like Basic Instinct, it's it's got such different interests, but people are reading it with that sort of like 90s like kind of pseudo self-aware, like kind of hard-edged, like this is so tame, when like you compare it to like Sharon Stone's
Mm-hmm.
interrogation scene or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually it does, like, I think American Psycho is actually a really interesting um comparison, because I interviewed Mary Herron a while ago, and one of the things I talked about with her was like about how uncomfortable the sex in American Psycho made viewers. And you know it's really, it's because like it's like, okay, these women are prostitutes, and they're obviously bored and not doing this terrible job, and it's really conveyed, and it's not sexy.
Right. No. Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
and it's like people are upset by that, and they're like, they think that that's bad. They don't want to see that. But there's something similar, I think, to that in like to the orgy thing, where it's like it's obvious that the women that are there are obviously hired to do a job. Like there's no moment really that you think otherwise. Like,
Right.
and it is
Right.
boring, and it is like, I think that like the orgy is like probably like the most like it's like the least sexy orgy imaginable.
Absolutely. It's super uncomfortable. It is like it's difficult to watch it because for that reason. Yeah. Totally agree.
Yes. And like,
Yeah.
and I think that has to do with these like reactions that people had, saying it's like not sexy, or like he's naive, he doesn't get it, he's an old man who just like hasn't left the house and doesn't understand
Mm.
like twisty contemporary sexuality. You're like, no, he does understand something about it. It's just not something that is palatable or comfortable, to sit with.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, you refer to Eyes Wide Shut as a fairy tale, and I think that's a great way of encapsulating what it is and why it sort of maybe is hard for people to get, because they are expecting kind of like Adrian Lyne, and they get Stanley Kubrick in this like weird, bizarre fairy tale once removed from reality sort of setting. And I also think of American Psycho as a similar kind of a fairy tale, right? Like certainly not what I would tell my kids before they go to bed, but in terms of the way that it's grounded, I think it's a similar sort of thing. In addition to that, it's got sort of these elements of fairy tales where these sort of strange characters kind of pop up momentarily and like serve a purpose and then go away and move on. And I also, a lot's been written about the fact that a lot of those characters and a lot of those kind of random moments are references to other Kubrick movies, and that Eyes Wide Shut has a lot of Kubrick references in it. The Lolita character, and they have like Full Metal Jacket on their DVD rack. There's all kinds of things that he throws into his own movies. I wonder if you have any thoughts about sort of how Kubrick saw this in terms, or how you think he saw this in terms of like the pantheon of his own work, and if this is sort of an encapsulation of everything, either to you as sort of a fan of his, or to him. Joey, I'll leave that open to you as well. Why is he referencing himself so much in this movie, and what do you think we can kind of take from that?
I mean, yeah, like it is, he was working on it for, like, didn't he first start working on it like decades earlier?
Yeah.
And I do think in some way, like it was, I mean, it's a little hard to know because obviously then he died. So like, but
it's not helpful. Yeah.
but it's like it's hard to get away from this. I mean, I certainly view it as like a culminating work,
Yeah.
and feel like these references like that are sprinkled throughout like lend weight to that feeling.
I'm just generally not a fan of when like creators are self-referential. Like I just watched a film that's about, I would say, on par with Eyes Wide Shut. I watched Ambulance this week, and which I actually did love. I don't want to talk shit about Ambulance. I also want to directly compare Michael Bay to Kubrick. But like 2 lines of dialogue, they reference The Rock and Bad Boys, and I'm just like, what are we doing here? And like Chuck Palahniuk has written himself into Fight Club 2, like the creator of Fight Club, like in the novel, in the graphic novel Fight Club 2, which is a real thing. He's a character as the creator of Fight Club. And I think what Kubrick's doing it is much more subtle than that. But I just don't understand, like, there's the weird other way of doing things where you think about, like, if they watch a movie in the universe, in any movie, if anybody in any movie is watching a movie, then, like, there's a whole, like, well, that actor was in that, and that actor was in the thing, and they're like, who knows? Like, that's a weird rabbit hole to go down. But I know it's maybe impossible. I don't know what it means. I'm not crazy about it. I don't know. But it's subtle enough or in the background enough or whatever that it's not what I'm remembering about this movie. Maybe it's just there's so much other stuff here. But I also think that could be the kind of thing where it's like that Room 237 documentary about The Shining. It's like, I don't know why there's not one of those about all of his movies or every movie. And like, I'm sure that one segment would be like, well, why is there a Full Metal Jacket VHS? What do we think that means? And it's like, well, actually, it's because this takes place during Vietnam. It's like, no, it doesn't. What are you talking about? So I don't know.
Yeah, he definitely like just had a thing for doing that and for like, seeding all of his movies with like infinite references. And why did he do that?
Like, I don't know. Like, is it, again, that kind of might be to a certain extent the Tom Cruise element, the character element in here, where it's just like a successful but just white guy with all the power is just like, how what can I do next? How can I get weird with this? It's like, well, don't do that.
I mean, the way I've always kind of read it is that it is in some way, and again, I think Lila makes a good point, that it's hard to have a final say on this because we didn't get to have the interviews with him after the movie came out to ask him these questions, which is one of the kind of weird, mysterious, enduring legacies of Eyes Wide Shut, that we do have to purely interpret it kind of on our own without Kubrick's guidance. But I always sort of looked at it as him exactly kind of saying that like there's an underlying thesis to all of these movies that he's made that you might have missed, and this being sort of his last statement, his last kind of cinematic statement, including these very clear kind of references to not all of his movies, but like certainly big references to a lot of the bigger ones. It's interesting that the ones that really kind of stood out to me are both Eyes Wide Shut and Clockwork Orange, which I think are the ones that are most commonly misunderstood in terms of what Kubrick wanted to get out of them. Not what, Burgess or Nabokov wanted to get out of them, but like what he wants to get out of them and what he wants you to see. And it's just sort of this last, I don't know, maybe this last kind of Hail Mary pass to viewers to say, go back and rethink it in this context, right?
Well, it's also the same thing with The Shining too, right? Like there's the
Right,
noted,
yeah.
like Stephen King's like, you ruined my book, and then he makes his version. Like people are like, well, that's a bad movie. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and also like, but what he has said about it is like also mysterious and contradictory.
Yeah,
like
true.
because he's both called it like, I think he called it like his greatest contribution to the art of cinema or something, and like, but he also has said really disparaging things about it. Like right before his death, there are reports that he like, I don't know, called it a piece of shit and was like despairing and disgusted. So it's like, then we're sort of like, well, which one was it?
Yeah. And I guess we have to decide as viewers, which is really tough. Yeah. We don't like to do that.
I mean,
we want to have the right opinion.
At least we want to know what. Yeah, right. Do we have his opinion? I mean,
right.
There's some, like, but also like, I do think that by this, I mean, there's something so like, I don't know. It feels like he's such a controlling director. It feels like an incredibly controlled piece of work. Like, I guess you like, but it is like there are so many different ways to read it that it becomes like, it becomes really like ambiguous. I think that that's why it's so satisfying as a object to rewatch over and over again.
Last thing I want to ask you before we sort of close up here is one of the ways that it's sort of taken on this sort of posthumous life over the last 20 some odd years is the way that the vision, like the kind of nature of the parties of the super duper elite who are removed from consequence within society has played into a lot of the conspiratorial meme framework that has emerged on the internet in the last several years. And I'm especially intrigued by the fact that the mansion used for the party was a Rothschild's mansion, which like doesn't help, right, in terms of fueling some of that. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of second life and whether or not there was an element that was, I don't know, almost sort of visionary that Kubrick was already sort of tapped into this sort of conspiracy theory minded culture that most of us didn't really know about until sort of QAnon and modern internet conspiracy theories?
That's an interesting question. Like, was he or was he actually invited to parties like this?
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, if you ask a QAnon believer, I'm sure they think he was, but I'm not sure that that's true. But that's also a great question.
I mean, yeah, like I think that not long after, like very shortly after my piece came out, like the Epstein stuff,
right,
broke.
It's wild.
It is really wild. I mean, I think that I don't, like, I mean, these ideas about like the elite having these parties where they, use their underlings are like also such like, I mean, it's not like a contemporary idea. I mean, it is, but it's been going on like forever.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's something about that too that actually feels really timeless. Like, yes, it is in the news right now, but like, it's also been something, I mean, there is an orgy like that that's described like in the original novella,
Right.
So
Sure.
it's, I think that there's a way that like, that he was tapping into something that's like true about like human society and like Western civilization. And and we're now going through an era where we're like becoming more aware of that or thinking about that more or feeling fresh outrage and shock and like persecuting the people who are behind it and stuff, but it's not like it's new. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think he clearly was tapped into that and interested in that, and
Yeah.
like obviously interested in the way that I don't know, the way that like humans can like destroy themselves and destroy each other, and like that's obviously been a preoccupation of his
Yeah.
throughout his career.
Yeah, and I mean, Rothschild conspiracy theories go back a long way. So I have a hard time believing he didn't know what he was sort of getting himself into in deciding to use one of their properties to film that scene.
Yeah, for sure. I think yes. I mean, I think that he like it's definitely like I don't yes, I don't think there are like accidental choices that he makes. I think it totally makes sense that he was thinking about that and that he was interested in that and like and using that as a way of like lending more weird world weight to it in the same way that like, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman lend this like weight to the film.
I think there is that historical sort of precedent or whatever that Shakespeare would write his plays to both the like people in the front who just want to see like nudity and violence and jokes and whatever, and then write to the people who like want to see like the grand narrative of it all. And it feels like Kubrick to a certain extent, and I don't think it's crazy to compare the two, that he's writing things that if you want to read into the conspiracy way, if you want to think about where they're actually shooting, where they're filming, what the location is, what that all means, you can. If you want to just see a movie where Nicole Kidman disrobes in the first 30 seconds, you can see that too. Or you see like just like a Tom Cruise. Like I think that there's something to the fact that he's writing a movie that applies to whatever mindset you want to bring to it. And I think that's effective. I think that's cool. I think that shows that he's got like a mastery of his craft, that no matter if you're a conspiracy nut, if you're not, if you're this, if you're that, like you can look into this and there's just enough movie here that you can take whatever reading you want out of it. And like, you're not wrong. It might not be right, but you're not wrong.
Yeah, and like I mean, there is the whole like there is the whole like conspiracy theory as well about like we never saw like the final film because like he delved too close to the Illuminati secrets,
I actually didn't even know that that was a conspiracy theory. That's interesting.
That is a conspiracy theory that exists because
Damn.
it's like too accurate in capturing whatever. I mean, and then there's all sorts of like symbols like throughout the film that are
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Masonic symbols
Yeah.
and like, allusions to that, all of that stuff, as well as like the title. I mean, the name itself is also an allusion to the I'm trying to remember, is it like maybe it's like a Mason's thing where it's like my eyes are shut to your misdeeds, my brother, I think is like the phrase that it's taken from.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, like he's definitely talking about all that stuff. But yes, but if you don't, but you can view it without that, and it's still it is interesting on many levels.
So before we go, we have two questions that we ask all of our guests.
So I think the answer to this one is probably obvious, but do you have a favorite movie from 1999?
I'm definitely going to go with Eyes Wide Shut.
Now, the answer to this might also be obvious. I don't know, because I know you've probably spent more time with this, but do you have a favorite movie of all time?
Someone asked me this the other day, and I was like so torn up about it. I was like, "Ask me what like for my 5 favorite slasher movies."
I don't have an answer either. It's
Yeah, it's a very. I mean, the question I was forced the other night to answer this. Like, I couldn't not answer it. It was like we couldn't move on with the dinner conversation until I answered it. My answer that I gave was Phantom Thread, and I don't know, like it's a fantastic movie. I love Phantom Thread. I'm gonna share that with you with just a caveat that like I cannot answer the question, but like perhaps that might be an answer in some moments of my day.
So a similar question that kind of combines the two, because the answer might be Eyes Wide Shut. Is there a movie that you can again, I think this is an obvious maybe, a movie that you can rewatch more than any other movie? Because I think like I don't know that Everybody Wants Some is my favorite movie, but if I could only watch one movie, I could rewatch that movie infinitely. That might mean it's my favorite movie. I don't know. But like it's the movie that I find comfort in, and that just has enough different stuff that I'm like, this I could watch this forever and be fine. I wouldn't want to, but like I could. Is that Eyes Wide Shut or is that a different movie?
Um, I mean, I think that just like, you know, I think that is the movie that I have watched the most times. Like,
I would hope so,
for
based
better
on
or
the
for
numbers.
worse.
Yeah.
As it happens.
But is it your comfort movie? Would you just pop it in to be like, well, it's a rainy afternoon, let's watch some Eyes Wide Shut?
I probably not. No.
Yeah.
Like a comfort movie. I more have comfort TV shows.
Oh, okay. That's fair.
I mean, for a long time, like my comfort, like I'm actually in search of a new comfort TV show. I mean, for many years, my comfort TV show was Buffy, but then I wrote this big profile about Joss Whedon, and
I've heard of that.
that's
Yeah.
I'm done with Buffy for now, I'd say.
Uh-huh.
No longer a comfort show.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. I didn't write the piece, and I read it, and I'm a huge Buffy fan as well, and I'm yeesh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Made me think twice about having that as a comfort show.
It's not something that you want to just fall asleep to.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah, certainly I've fallen asleep to it many times in the past.
Yep.
Well, I wish you well on your pursuit of a new comfort show. I don't know what I'd recommend to a Buffy fan who can't watch Buffy anymore. I mean, the first thing I'd say is Angel, but that's not going to help.
No.
I will say, if you're looking for something to fall asleep to, there was this group of Hollywood film editors that dubbed themselves Racer Trash based on a line in Speed Racer. And they've disbanded since, but they've put all of their stuff that they used to just stream on Twitch. You have to be there live to watch it. But they've since put everything up on the Internet Archive, and a lot of it's on their Vimeo too. But they took Eyes Wide Shut and they did their remixing of it, where they like put things out of order and they cut in other movies, and they like put visual effects on and different songs in there. And it's just this whole, like, they remake it in their own image, and it's amazing. It's wonderful. I watched the movie and I watched this. But after the movie, which they condensed down to about like an hour 20-ish, they got a whole like way that they do it. They have a bunch of different people doing it. They have like a 15 or 20 minute, what they call like a sleep wave, which is like something you're kind of supposed to fall asleep to. But that for this movie is phenomenal. So it's called Vibes Wide Shut. So if you want to find it, look on vimeo.com/racertrash or just the Internet Archive. You can search for them on there. But they did a couple movies from 1999, because I think it's just a bunch of people who are like our age roughly, who grew up in the 90s and like internalized all these movies and are just having their way with it. So if you're looking for something to fall asleep to, I don't know that this will be the thing, but like it's kind of the goal. So I would highly recommend Vibes Wide Shut.
Wow. Okay, I definitely want to check that out. That sounds fantastic.
Lila, is there a way to, or I should ask you this way, if people want to find more of your work and or connect with you, where do they go?
Okay, they can look at my Twitter, although I did recently delete my Twitter. Before I published the Joss piece, I deleted my Twitter history.
Smart.
But they could find me there. They can also find me at Lila Shapiro at NewYorkMagazine.com. I'm there, and that's where most of my work is as well.
And what's the status of the novel upon which Eyes Wide Shut is an influence?
I'm working on revisions right now. I had taken a year off in between like staff writing jobs, and I like wrote it and I rewrote it, and then I got this staff job and I kind of had to take a break, but now I've actually recently picked it back up. So yeah, there is a orgy party scene at the centerpiece of it.
And it's at Tom Cruise's house.
The main character is Tom Cruise. No, I was going to say, I'm looking forward to reading it and looking to some of the subtle allusions to Eyes Wide Shut, but apparently I'm not going to have to look very far. We will keep an eye out for that and certainly mention it when and if we're still doing the show when that comes out. Lila, it's been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
Thank you so much, Joey. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time.
And it's Temple of Doom, The Goonies, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Encino Man. It's like, what? And that's it, basically. Everything else is like a documentary, a thing about a thing. Wow. All right.